All right, Jason, we are live for the inaugural top level domain conversation.
Awesome. Inaugural.
The inaugural. Yeah, I thought I'd work that in there. The inaugural. We'll see if anyone joins us live. I know a lot. We were just talking before I hit the play button that
Yeah.
a lot of people will probably listen recorded if they listen at all. But we're really doing this for ourselves, right?
Oh, yeah. We're having a fun conversation.
Fun conversation for ourselves, and then
Because who else would talk about these two topics? Well, I haven't been able to find anyone until I found you. So if nothing else, I'm going to enjoy this.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. Well, so I'm going to share this online really quick, but to do that, I'm going to distract everyone that I'm not paying attention by asking you, how did you get into all this neuroscience psychology stuff? And why is it that, and then we could talk about how we found each other too.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds like a dating conversation.
Well,
we met online. Yeah.
No, we actually met in person.
No, we met in the real, didn't we? In the analog. Yeah. So, well, I'll give you a little, because this bit is the most interesting bit for me to explain the journey to get here. Because I think for people listening to this, I think they're going to be surprised and resonate and go, yeah, I've seen all those things leading up to this place and this juncture. I've been trying to make sense of something going on at the moment. So this is a sort of 20-year journey for me. I was a full-time church planter and pastor, and I went off and did a doctor of ministry in 2003 at Portland Seminary, and I was diagnosing a problem about consumer culture. Well, I made a diagnosis. It helped me realize why in consumer culture are we training people to dispense religious goods and services, consume religious goods and services. Okay, that was the problem I landed on around about 2006. That then took me into a PhD, because I then think I've got a problem I want to figure out and I want to understand broadly. And what I did was I did theology and social science, which is important for this domain here and method. I wanted to think, how can I make an account of how evangelicalism has developed in relationship to capitalism, for good or ill, owning up to that in all its ugliness. I got sick and tired of people saying that there was a terrible relationship, but not really understanding what the relationship was. Now, that led me to some conclusions about how things developed over time, symbiosis with markets, globalization, mechanisms of commodification, but really landed on this place of desire and habits. And some ideas that what we love shapes what we do. Very Augustinian notion. Right. Worship, affectivity, autopoiesis, self-creation, metaphor, social imaginaries, agency, and habits. And I know you've done a PhD. You sort of get to that place thinking, now I know how to do a PhD. If I was doing one again, I would do this. Yeah? Did you get there?
That's where I've come from. I was like, man, if I was doing a PhD now, I would do it on neuroscience and theology, but I just did it on Augustine and Hegel and,
Exactly. And we're not going to do the German higher doctorate thing. That's just, well, I'm not going to do that. Yeah. So that's not going to happen. So really, for me, this is like my post-doctoral ongoing research. Joking aside, if I could do this again, I do this. But I think I don't have to. That's why you have a PhD. You can carry on researching. So,
exactly.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to figure out here, for me, there's a space. I've arrived at a diagnosis of the problem, but wanting to go even further into it. And I'd say it broadly this way. What's going on with habits and practices, imagination and metaphor? And first, I want to understand that concretely, behaviorally, things that you can observe as lived experience. And by the way, I realized that social theory is not social reality. That's one of the big things I realized in my PhD. And also theological theory is not social reality. I got tired of theologians, I won't name some, coming up with the most amazing postulations for alternative to capitalism. I mean, just living in fantasy land, you're just going to reinvent capitalism yourself from your theological standpoint. So, and also tired, I didn't like social theory. I did a lot of social theory, a lot of continental philosophy, and thinking these descriptions of reality, do they inhere with lived experience in everyday life? So that really started to push me into social science and behavioralism. And again, that's where I would go. And then second, what I wanted to do was, along with social science, to lean into what's really happening with people, was the metaphysical. Yeah? These ideas of what does it mean to be a human being, and value and purpose and identity. I mean, these are the huge things that are being debated at the moment in everyday life, the metaphysical. And I mean, again, this is probably more your bag than mine. This distinction between the metaphysical and the behavioral, Hume rejected it completely, Kant rejected most of it, but made some room for it. Wittgenstein tried to. And I think, crudely, let's get it down to brass tacks. There are so many popular books on leadership and behaviors and habits and deep work that are starting to press into that space. They're lensing from the behavioral of academics into that space of how do human beings construct identity in their imagination and action, but also in terms of the philosophical and the psychological. So Steven Pinker, people might be familiar with him, all his books. He's leaning into that space. Jordan Peterson on the subconscious and unconscious, Jungian archetypes and metaphors. And he's straying into metaphysics, even though he's been trying to avoid it. And then Atomic Habits.
Peterson has, or did you say?
Oh yeah, Jordan Peterson. He's always trying to avoid metaphysics, but we'll get there in the conversation. How does the psychological lend itself not just to the behavioral, but also the metaphysical? Atomic Habits, really popular book. You familiar with that book? Best-selling book.
I haven't read it, but I know about it.
Yeah, lovely guy. I knew him before he was famous and sold millions of books. And in his popular book that takes a lot of theory about habits, the behavioral, it's absolutely fascinating, distilling that down to a popular book. He opens it with that the fundamental issue underneath everything is identity, who you are. I mean, there's a metaphysical statement right there. First principles, order, and identity. So this is just exploding everywhere. So that sort of led me to thinking, okay, so theologically, how can I better understand human beings' desire, purpose, and identity? And that led me, ultimately, I was looking around trying to find a resource and said, you know what? And I found a few things that were sort of saying, well, we need to consider the psychological and Christian practice. I mean, that's been around for a while. But someone trying to, and I'm most interested in this discussion about methods. How can we bring these different disciplines together? So came across this book in just doing a ton of journal searches, actually. And off the back of, thinking fast, thinking slow, everyone's familiar with. I mean, this guy, Henriques, doing a critique of that book and saying, I wish people read my work that no one's read. Because he says, I've been trying to say this forever and I didn't get a Nobel Prize for it or whatever it was. I thought, okay, apart from the sour grapes. So went and got his book and found this whole field that he's been working in and within the field of psychology, and saying psychology for a lot of people can either be the behavioral or it can be the deeply philosophical. And actually, how do you bring all those realms together? And I thought, oh, fantastic. Here is someone who's trying to bridge those worlds of the metaphysical and the behavioral within a particular discipline. So I was most interested in him, not so much because of the psychology, but the way he was trying to do that. So there you go. That's what got me here to today and that book that we're discussing. And then you and I said, have you read this book? And you went, no. And we started to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. You and I have kind of known each other off and on for a long time. I think when we both got our doctorates is when we fell off from each other, because you get pretty busy when you're doing a doctorate and you're a pastor of a local church and you're trying to raise a family. Go figure, right?
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, I've been traveling those similar realms. I probably started the high philosophy and theology, Augustine and Hegel, ancient modern philosophy and theology, how they understand personal subjectivity in relationship to God. When I was writing about how do we find freedom, and does a transcendent God inhibit freedom, or does it actualize or create freedom in us? And because in one sense, that's the basic terms of the debate between modern and ancient, or Christian and kind of secular philosophy, is does God trap us and hinder and destroy human freedom by his laws, or transcendent encroachment on our development, or whatever, however you want to say that? Or does God, as transcendent who comes to us, somehow lead and free and fulfill, all those types of things, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So those are kind of the coordinates that I was looking at. And then personally, my wife and I were just on this kind of prayer journey and recovery journey, trauma and things, and just
Mm,
experiencing how neuroscience and spiritual formation were being kind of linked together in certain
yeah.
realms. And then,
Mm,
as a researcher, as you are, I was just like, well, I need to take a deep dive. I can't take everyone else's word for this. So over the last like 4 or 5 years, I've been studying all this stuff.
mm,
And then you and I started reconnecting. We're like, oh wait, we think we're doing all this. So we're like, we should just like read a book together and talk about it, and then maybe make
yeah.
it public and see if anyone else is interested. I don't know. So that's how we got to a
Mm,
new unified theory of psychology, which is by Gregg Henriques,
yeah.
Henrique,
I
depending
can
on how
see
you say.
Henry, but who
Yeah,
knows? I probably got it completely
I
wrong.
I
Completely.
know.
He'll
Who
never
knows?
come on the show now that I just called it a show. He'll never come on now that I got his name wrong.
Oh,
But
we want him on the show. We'll see if we can get him on here.
we'll send this to him
Yeah, for
if
sure.
maybe.
Well, so the reason why I wanted to read it when you suggested it was because
Yeah.
I've been doing a lot of neuroscience. Um,
Mm,
but I kind of wanted to backfill kind of the general discipline of psychology where neuroscience kind of came out of, and it always, references all these other types of things. So I was like, oh yeah, I should go back and kind of
yeah.
look at that and kind of fill out my kind of basic understanding. And this book kind of goes
Mm,
through all those different things, which is fantastic. And
yeah.
then while I was reading it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so helpful
Mm,
because he starts talking about the current problem with psychology as a field. And
mm,
while he was going through that, I was like, man, he's like describing theology also. Like the field of theology seems to
yeah.
be in similar disarray, um, in the sense that
You
like
mean in all its silos?
yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah.
all the different splintering of the fields. So he was talking about how psychology, you have cognitive, behavioral,
Mm,
psychodynamic,
yeah. 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 I remember.
positive, humanistic, and things like that. And I was just thinking the same thing with theology. You have biblical, you have
Yeah.
historical, philosophical, apologetic, systematics, and also
Yeah.
pastoral. And then he was talking about the distinction between research psychologists and clinical psychologists,
Mm,
and how like the applied work of a clinician is different but related to
yeah.
researchers. And I was like, that's the same thing, as both of us are both
Yeah.
pastors and theologians.
Yeah.
We see that distinction, like,
Mm,
yeah, these are sometimes very different goals and methods and
mm,
desires. And uh, he was talking about how clinicians are very ad hoc and they just kind of find what works. And I was like, you talk to any pastor, that's really what they're doing. They might claim a theological tradition, but they're
yeah.
just finding what works. So there was
Yep.
kind of multiple things. And then he was talking about,
Mm,
well, why is psychology so important? And he said after Descartes and
mm,
psychology has really been the center of modern Western philosophy since Descartes. So when you start with the thinking person, I think, therefore I am, that's kind of changed to the acting person. I act, therefore I
mm,
am. What I do is who I am. Now we're
yeah.
kind of in the postmodern, what I feel and what I make myself
Mm,
to be is who I am, right? But it still starts with reference to myself. Whereas in the
yeah.
ancient world, you try to reference,
Mm,
what was out there.
yeah.
And so I do think, like, I'm excited for this conversation because they are
Yeah.
just like overlapping.
Mm.
I think you can't do good theology without also doing good psychology, and that's true for pastoral work too, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, you think of it as a pastor, you're playing amateur psychologist all the time. Why are people behaving the way they're behaving? Why are they thinking the way they're thinking? I mean, and again, good pastors even do it intuitively, don't they?
Mhm.
You learn to read people. You know what's going on below and underneath. You know what's taking place. We're good pastors. We're all good amateur psychologists, for sure. I mean, and it's interesting how we've come to this as slightly, quite different directions. I mean, I guess my method was political theology and talking about silos. I remember the condescension that you get from some people when you said, so what's your discipline? Political theology. Oh, it's one of those modern, newfangled things.
Mhm.
And there was real theology and doing stuff. So, agree with you. And I think for me, it was the political theology that helped me look at how do you make good, because this is the pastor in me, and the same as you. I want to know what's really going on and understand it better. I'm
Mhm.
not interested in abstract accounts that may or may not have some coherence to reality, because the irony for me is it's the epiphenomena I'm most interested in. It's the outworking of research, not the pure research itself. Not to dismiss pure research, but
Mhm.
just how does this help day to day in Christian formation and practice for myself and for the people that I care for and others around me. And that's what pushed me from a sort of, maybe a more bottom-up political theology account. So things like agency and identity and how we create our identities. Well, and once you start looking at social imaginaries and Charles Taylor and then even James K.A. Smith, some of the people listening to this will be more familiar with, you go, well, what's really going on there? If it's about curriculums and liturgies and what we do shapes what we desire, what's going on inside us? That's what you want to know, isn't it? What makes, spiritual direction, which is so popular at them. I mean, you notice these things, the Enneagram, spiritual direction. Everyone's like, pay attention to what you're paying attention to. Well, how does the brain focus? Well, how do we pay attention? How do we think through things? These are all huge neuroscience questions and habit questions. So it makes sense to look at them.
Yeah, and how do you get to those lower levels of motivation? I remember early on in my liturgical turn, like early 2000s, we were going from just a low church kind of, evangelical, whatever, to more of a high church practice. And I remember talking to an old Lutheran pastor, and he's like, Geoff, liturgy doesn't fix everything. And he's coming from that tradition of the deep spiritual formation. And it's just like, yeah, you can go through the motions and you could do things, and people can do the same behaviors for totally different motivations. But sometimes we as pastors, we might celebrate someone's, activity, or they signed up for this, or they're really faithful at that. And we think that spiritual formation is happening. And maybe that's just a deep coping mechanism, or maybe that's a really ingrained sinful pattern and we're celebrating it. Right. And so like, how do we make sense of these things?
Don't you feel, I mean, maybe it's a dirty little secret of pastors. Sometimes you can feel like in your planning, we're drawing on the cognitive a lot of the time for leadership materials and going, if we do things this way, it helps with people's attention. If we do things this way, it taps into primary motivations, instincts. I mean, it's all cloaked under all the stuff that we're imbibing and reading on practical leadership stuff day to day. I sometimes wonder, we're sitting there like, are we just finding clever ways to get things in front of people who are mindlessly scrolling on social media? Like, is that what we're reduced to? Is one of the questions in my PhD I got to. Do we get to a place where we're just like competing affectations and aesthetics with people, and in a way, some of the things that maybe we decry, I mean, it's one of the critiques of evangelicalism in history. It tapped into some of those things. That's one of either its genius or its downfall. And are we just going to keep perpetuating that? And then ultimately there's a question, well, it's later on in the thing, where is God? This is a huge question for me. Where is God mediated in our practices? Are there things he takes part in more than others? And how does he engage with neuroscience and ourselves?
Yeah. Well, that's for later, or a different book.
Later, definitely. I want to get to that later.
not even later today, but like in a future, top level domain number 4, number 3, or something like that. If we can pry, Jordan Peterson on somehow and get to know his ages. Well, just a quick timeout for all of you who are listening or watching online. First of all, thank you so much. But if you do have comments or questions, feel free to shoot those in the comments, and we'll be able to see them and kind of work them into what we're thinking through. So back to the book. Okay, so you proposed this book.
Yeah.
Which is a new unified theory of psychology. Now it's new and it's unified. So Henriques, and we'll just settle on Henriques.
Henriques.
He owns that this is kind of a left turn away from postmodern theory. Is that to seek a unified, an integrated, really a foundational kind of method. And so he says this is a postmodern grand meta narrative, that he is seeking a comprehensive understanding of human nature, human motivation, human sociality. And he fully admits that there's a modern kind of, twang to it that might be disconcerting to certain people. But then he says, but the perspective also that his theory is also incorporating the idea that everything really comes down to perspective, and that reality is socially constructed. And so he's trying to take on the social construction of reality, that people perceive and understand and interact with the world differently. But there's a way of describing that in a unified kind of fashion. I have some thoughts on how that connects to some theological projects, or what we could do theologically, but how did that hit you initially when you thought that? Were you like, yes, finally, like we've gone too far the postmodern route, like let's wind it back? Or were you a little concerned when you read that, or how did that hit you?
Yeah, no, it resonated with me. And again, where do we splinter this off to? So, the realm of the postmodern meta narratives and where we're at. And you and I have been part of lots of conversations for 20 years probably on those kinds of things. But instinctively, it resonated with me. Of course, I understand at a base level the idea of the grand narrative beyond the meta narrative, which makes sense. And I'm increasingly more critical because I've had more time to see the effects of it, of postmodern narratives and having a place to stand and understanding. So yes, human beings, we're wonderfully individual, but we have unique shared experiences in social reality, and cognitive science and behavioral science shows us that's the case. We have ways in common of using language, of making meaning and building things in the world. And so, yes, so beyond a sort of cursory critique of there is no meaning at all and it's just whatever we ascribe to it, it's like, no, that's not what happens in life. That's not how human beings really live. Behavioral scientists will say that's not how human beings construct reality and do reality. So yeah, it resonated with me straight away as a doorway into, okay. But then, then I'm intrigued saying, okay, so what is that? How are you deploying that with regards to this? So not for social theory, but for psychology. So then that was the interesting turn, because obviously it's not my field. So I'm just along for the ride to learn at that point. What did you learn?
Well, I'm still kind of, waiting to see the whole project unfold as we talk. But, since we were talking about deep motivations and how we try to know ourselves, and because I'm the guy with all the buttons, and I asked for live comments and, questions. So my good friend Nathan Clare said, Geoff, that's an amazing shirt. So there we go. So because I am an Enneagram 3, I always want to present myself in the best possible light. And my good friend Nathan is picking up on that. So thank you, Nathan, for listening and for participating in that way that affirms my ego. So there we go. That's an example of how
we reached the point where it is impossible to do a podcast, video cast without mentioning the Enneagram.
It kind of is, actually. So as an aside, I just started this podcast. It's a more popular level podcast than this one.
Yeah, that's awesome.
On being with, on neuroscience. And everyone's like, you should do this and this on the Enneagram. And you should do that and that on the Enneagram. I was like, I'm not going to do a single episode on the Enneagram on my podcast. But then part of me is like, but I want to grow my audience, so I probably should do it. So now we're getting into motivations and how we invest ourselves.
Exactly. Being honest.
So as a theologian, I was thinking, well, yeah, I kind of want a postmodern grand meta narrative for theology.
Yeah.
And someone like Sarah Coakley has actually started expressing something like that in the first of, I don't remember how many volumes she's still working on.
And a new book still delayed, isn't it? It's been driving me crazy.
So yeah. So in her most recent book, which is about 5 years old, God, Sexuality, and the Self, she kind of talks about what she calls a theology totale, rather than a systematic theology. And she kind of takes these 3 postmodern critiques and gives them their due, but then says we can still do theology in the midst of them. The 3 of them are kind of like the philosophical, the political, and the feminist critique. So she says that there is a critique that theology, and not just theology, but philosophy, seeks to master or capture God by its language, that God is really bigger than all of our language and all of our concepts. And so we can't really, this is the ontotheological critique, going back to Heidegger and others. That theology, so her answer, coming from a contemplative perspective, is that theology should always center on practices of unknowing and unmastery. And so there's a process of unknowing myself and a process of unknowing who I think God is, in order so that I can truly know myself and truly know who God is. And so she kind of looks at the contemplative practices of the ancient church to say, well, theology is ultimately contemplative. So we're unknowing these types of things. And we can still do our theological work if we always know that it's as much unknowing as it is knowing. And then the second critique is that theology is always a practice of the privileged, and it's using strategies to consolidate power. So this is kind of a political critique, is that those who are in privilege always want to stay in privilege, and they'll create discourses to perpetuate that privilege. And so she says, yes, that's true. And so theology must always be open and risk destabilizing itself by other discourses. So I'm hoping that we're doing that. We're going to destabilize even our own theology by opening us up to psychology. You think, and then the last one is the feminist critique, is that oftentimes there is a disembodied masculine discourse that kind of controls things. And so can we recover embodied practices of thought? But then she says, without essentializing masculine or feminine ways of being. So we can't get into the trap that there's a particularly masculine and a particularly feminine way of being, but we do want to be embodied. And I think psychology, at least as it's currently practiced, is becoming very embodied. And so I think there's a lot to learn, especially in the neuroscience. Like that. So those are just some of the things that were swimming around in my mind. Are you familiar with Coakley's work or gone through that?
I'm familiar with it. I haven't read very much of her work. I mean, I have the God and Sexuality one, and she writes beautifully. Absolutely, if theology can be beautiful, it's beautiful the way she writes, and she's amazing to listen to, and she is a priest, out on the front line in lived life and experience. I find her theology esoteric, to be honest with you, just because it's too far outside my area. So I knew you were going to be mentioning her today, and I'm like, at this point, I'm listening in, going, I'm learning something here. So not sure I can offer anything, not anything academically robust in response to that. I'm just listening in to you at that point, and that's your bag, really. It's interesting. This is why this conversation is so interesting for me today with you bringing that in here, because I wouldn't have known to do that. So tell me a bit more.
Well, I think she's a part of theologians who want to continue to theologize. So there's coming out of the high postmodern, at the end of the last century, there was kind of the crisis of the theologian, of the theological. Can we really still do theology proper, or is that just a white man's pursuit, or is that just a domineering pursuit? Should we not just do liberation, feminist, and kind of have these different disciplines? And so in that way, it mirrors what Henriques is saying happened to psychology, is, well, we can't really have a unified framework. We just have behaviorism, we have cognitive science, we have family systems theory, and we just kind of move in and out. And so she is, in a sense, trying to take on the lessons of the postmodern critique of kind of the hyper-rational modernity, high modernity, post-enlightenment philosophy, but then saying we can still move forward and we can still say true things about God. And that's what I find hopeful, at least in this conversation, is, I have a lot of people I talk with that are just trying to find meaningful lives.
Yes.
But the question of whether things are true have kind of gone out the door. And I want people to have meaningful lives. I do. I really do. I just also want them to be true, and the things that we do and believe to, have that truth. And so maybe that's where I'm postmodern.
Yeah. And isn't that the issue? So if we pick up something from there, as I say, I can't speak to Sarah Coakley directly, but of unknowing that you mentioned, and the postmodern turn, and Henriques picks up this issue of folk psychology again, which is why he was very compelling, and it reminded me of notions of folk theology, in the best sense. I don't mean in a denigrating or pejorative sense, of lived theologies for most people who are struggling doing life. Most people, when they do their theology, aren't going round thinking deep questions about unknowing. Am I unknowing myself today? But they are trying to we are meaning-making creatures. I mean, that's one of the things that we learn from behavioral science and cognitive science. We make meaning. We try to establish meaning. We have cognitive biases, and one of the reasons we have them is because we're meaning-making machines in the best sense. And even when it comes to our psychology, I like the way that he was integrating that into his unified theory, this common experience from the ground up about how people live and generate their psychological dispositions and understandings that make sense to them and can be shared. And that got me thinking about the theological ones as well as that we do, generated from the ground up, rather than from top down, and appreciate that in his project here.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's maybe shift then to the more practical then. So what can we
Okay.
do? So Stephen on YouTube asks, in what practical I can't talk right now. In what practical ways can a pastor utilize this integrative approach when moving among different subcultures? And I think this is a question that pastors have, whether you've drunk deeply of the postmodern well or not, which is, people behave and respond differently. We have different ethnicities, different cultures. You're in England, I'm in America. I'm living in the Midwest, and so even though we speak the same language, right, we experience all these things differently. And so how can we approach these things practically? So one option is to kind of say real woodenly, well, all people are the same. This is the modern approach, and you just need to, proclaim the gospel, or teach the truth, and then people will be transformed. And then you kind of have the kind of other postmodern high diversity. Everyone is so different that you can't know what's going on. All you can do is listen, and God is at work there already. And so you just have to kind of experience what you experience when you move into a situation. And anything else is coercive or destructive or something like that. And so what I see, that the full unified project that Henriques is trying to say is, well, we can say things that are common about people, all people, any person, any human being. There's certain things that you can say with accuracy, but then there's a lot of variables that happen. And so can we learn what are the common things, and then how do the variations kind of work? So the first thing, so he has a 4-stage kind of theory, and we're going to look at the first one, is what he calls the behavior investment theory. And because I pressed all the buttons, I have this right here. Let's see.
Oh, excellent.
What is the behavior investment theory? Dun, dun, dun.
Tell us.
Okay, the behavior investment theory, part 1. It claims, and this is a quote from page 45, the behavior investment theory claims that for any animal to survive and to thrive, its actions must result in an overall positive return on its investment in work effort. That is, it must ultimately acquire more workable energy and other necessary materials as a consequence of its behavior than what the behavior costs. Okay, so this is really kind of economics applied to behavioral science and biology. He's basically saying, for living beings, especially animals, who make choices rather than plants who kind of just passively, get things from the world. But for animals that make choices, their choices must result in more energy at the end of the day than less energy. Otherwise, they die. They won't survive. So that's the kind of the basic idea. So the first principle is what he calls energy economics. So one must secure more energy from a behavior than you expend on that behavior. And this is the really interesting thing that we could spend a little bit of time on, is he links this to the second law of thermodynamics. So that is the law of entropy. See, we're getting really nerdy here, right?
The law of entropy.
Yeah. So the law of entropy is that energy always flows to a less complicated or less complex state. So it's moving from chaos to order, from high energy to a kind of low energy.
Yeah.
So the definition of life is, for him, and I've always thought this too, which I was really grateful, when someone else who's published agrees with you, right? That's always very gratifying. He said, he's basically saying life is a defense against entropy. Now, what did you think when you read that? Is that something you had thought before too? Or is that life is a defense against entropy?
Yes and no. So lots of yeses in this. I suppose this is theology. If we get to what does theology have to say to this? It's always, okay, yeah, I can see that. The denial of death and youth culture. I mean, all the practical manifestations of how we avoid the fact that we're all going to die. The number of great books that will tell you in history, go through life knowing that you're going to die and order your life around that. And the different ways that human beings live before that realization. Everything flows from that. But what does, yes, entropy is a reality in the law of thermodynamics, but what does it mean for the resurrection? Where is the resurrection in that moment? Where is God's economy in that moment? Where is the kingdom in that moment? And so that's one of the places that there is a limit. And again, that's a conversation about the integration of, and again, it's beyond my pay grade to know if God suspends the laws of thermodynamics, but you get into those kinds of high level conversations. But yes, you could, I mean, say as a practitioner as well, you're like, yeah, you see that in everyday life. Conserving energy. Am I getting bang for my buck? What's in this for me? Is this worth doing? But you see the opposite in the lived Christian experience from time to time. You see people living in ways and things occurring that seem to go against that and undo that. So what is that the manifest? I mean, one of the things I've got down here is how we understand that. So I'm reading it thinking, so this is the fall, because ultimately he doesn't answer the question, and most people in all these fields won't answer the question, why are human beings like that? Why is human nature like this? Why, if that is the shared lived experience of people, why is that? And what's the response to that? And that's where Christians have to go to the theological and have a different answer than, well, it just depends how much you're getting out of this, because of entropy. That's not going to motivate most people day to day for the mission of the kingdom, is it?
No, right. And so that's capitulating to entropy. So I would say that life is actually, it's a revolt against entropy. So life is, so entropy is just, so if you have a rock just stays where it is unless an energy pushes it, right?
Yeah.
Or Henriques says, if you're thinking about a gas bubble floating up in a pond, its natural laws, of buoyancy and whatever, will cause it to go up until it hits a rock or leaf, and then it stops because a different law is applied, and it just stays there. It doesn't look for more energy to get around the rock, and it doesn't use more of its own energy to do something about it. It just sits there because those are the laws that it follows. But if a frog was floating from the bottom of a pond and wanted to, it had the purpose to arrive at the top of the pond and hit a rock or a leaf, what would it do? Well, it would expend a little bit of energy to swim to the left or to the right or up or down to get around the hindrance. As she says, and I don't even think Henriques and most kind of evolutionary psychologists and others really think about that, but that really is a marvel. How did we get in the history of the universe, and they'll just put complexity in there, but in the history of the universe, how did random organizations of matter and energy all of a sudden start using its own energy to make decisions to get around the natural flow of the energy that it was already in? Because that's what life is. Life is seeking out other resources of energy so that it can expend energy and keep living and then reproduce itself. I just find that a marvel. And so and in that example, there's a purpose that's built in. The purpose is to find more energy in order to use more energy, and to find more energy and to use more energy, and then to pass down those genes to something else, which is not where rocks don't have any of those purposes. So that was the first thing, and we'll kind of get back to maybe that purpose language later. But I thought that energy economic kind of mentality seems so straightforward, like we're just making cost benefit, but inert non-living things don't do that. They don't make cost benefit decisions.
No, and human beings behave differently to frogs.
Well, yeah, vastly. So that's a problem.
There is that behaviorally.
And that's why Freud,
human beings have purpose. Human beings have consciousness. What's the purpose of consciousness?
Yes.
I mean, all these issues. So again, how do and those again theological things that you want to say, how would this fit in here? Because it's one of the challenges with a book like this. You see what he's trying to do with psychology, which is not my area of expertise. As I say, I'm looking at this in terms of more interested in the methods of how he's trying to integrate these different disciplines with one another without knowing enough about each of those disciplines. But again, you can start to look at it theologically and go, well, what about purpose? What about consciousness? I mean, and again, those are psychological aspects of shared human experience that lends themselves into the theological. So keep going.
Well, so he just goes through 6 different things, and we don't have to spend too much time on it. I just wanted to focus on that first one about his definition of life. But he just talks about how evolution kind of selects for energy efficiency, that
Yeah.
survival. He's redefining, well, what does survival mean? And it just means that which
Yeah.
most effectively finds and uses energy. Um,
Mm.
and then our genetic and epigenetic development and dispositions are
Mhm.
toward energy efficiency. He talks about how our nervous systems then control and regulate our own internal energy supply. So like our sympathetic nervous system, when it's activated for fight and flight responses, that's
Mhm.
a high energy expending kind of state. And then when our parasympathetic sympathetic nervous systems kind of
Yeah.
kick in, that's an energy conserving state, right? So we go between those two,
Mhm.
um, and then we basically learn how to do that by learning. And so he talks about like how we
Yeah.
learn and experience these types of things. And so he just fills out these different kind of developmental and genetic
Mm.
kind of situations within an evolutionary framework, all based
Mhm.
on this idea of kind of redefining natural selection as energy efficiency,
Mhm.
which I find an interesting idea, um, that he would kind of
Yeah.
do that. Um,
Mhm.
and I think pastorally and even ourselves, like we find that people do that. So he has this really great. I see some questions kind of pulling up, so I'll look at those in a second. But at the end of the chapter, he has this really great application. He says, "Well, when we look at
Yeah.
depression, you can
Yes.
see that
Yeah. Remember that. Yeah.
depression is really
Yeah.
an example."
Reducing behavioral expenditures. Yeah.
Yeah, so depression is a
Yeah.
behavioral investment strategy.
Yeah.
It's not consciously, right? But he says,
Mm.
um, we often now currently we
Mm.
often subscribe or prescribe, drugs
Yes.
to fix a neurological problem
Mm.
that, maybe the brain's not firing properly to, do all such
Mm.
things. And he says that might be true, but what if the behavior investment theory says we should look at environmental factors, which
Yeah.
is if a woman who is in kind of an abusive or neglectful
Mm.
relationship has found that all of her behaviors to connect, to find intimacy, to find help and support with her husband have all been rejected, then behavior investment theory will say, well, you'll stop investing in those behaviors and you'll stop investing in all behaviors because you've started believing that your actions don't matter. And when you start believing your actions don't matter, what do? You just shut down and
Mm.
conserve energy. You no longer expend energy, you
Mm.
conserve energy. And so he was talking about, could we not also think of depression
Mm.
as that energy conserving, relational conserving kind of um,
Mm.
state that someone flips into because they believe their actions won't gain them more relational or
Yeah.
social or even, kind of literal like
Mhm.
resources. And so why
Yeah.
expend that energy? So how did that
Right.
example kind of sit with you to explain how we could
Yeah.
maybe think about these
Yeah.
things?
I remember that, and again, I've got. My little list here. He said, "What it means is human beings are like animals, controlling flows of resources. It understands the operative conditioning of human beings and behavior." And suggested that it helps us understand the relationship between perception, emotion, and motivation. And then, like you say, the one on depression, those seem to be the big four that he was landing on. And I must admit, say, beyond the complexity of what behavioral investment theory is and the risk of misunderstanding it, what I was hearing was this: it does reduce us to creatures acting in response to effort and benefit. And I'm like, is that really everything that's going on? And again, as a theologian of some sort, you have to say, is that really? Does that really explain everything that's going on in life? Because I don't think it is. But
Mhm.
I do think it is part of a picture that we can see for these, if we lens back to curriculums of desire and how people do things. But fundamentally, yes, it might day to day show that what people do, we trade purpose for comfort all the time. Why is that? Well, this would help us understand that. But
Mhm.
I was thinking of contrasting examples, and maybe at a popular level, to bring in someone like Jordan Peterson, something very different. Again, I wish I could get him to answer Henriques, to put them together and ask them this question, because otherwise you're just rubbing around in the dark. But one of the big things I've been drawing from Jordan Peterson is actually at an epigenetic level, that taking responsibility switches things on in you, that expending the amount of, is where Peterson on becomes Christocentric, take on so much responsibility that it almost kills you.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's where real meaning and purpose in life are found, that can be measured psychologically and psychogenetically.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I would love to ask, say, how does that lends itself much more to a Christian understanding, take on the greatest responsibility you can that takes you to the cross, so that you have to experience whatever God does with regards to entropy and effort. Again, that would be a fascinating space to try and bring those two things into conversation. So I've probably posed more questions than answers, but it did leave me with, are you right? Can I just take this into a side route for something of interest?
We got about 15 more minutes, so whatever.
Okay. I want to talk about Jesus and amygdala hijacking.
Oh, okay. Amygdala
Jesus,
hijacking.
Jesus,
I'm just taking this stack of notes and just putting them over here. We'll get back to those later.
Of so, Jesus, again, let's take our Christology. Jesus, fully human like us in every way. Presumably, he's had an amygdala. The two bits of it sitting there, learning from life, having adrenaline rushes, cortisol flushes, dopamine hits. Presumably, all those things were happening to him. Otherwise, he wouldn't be fully human.
Right.
So, and expending effort. And we know that Jesus got tired. He got weary with the woman at the well. And I just one of the ways for me just to pass this out and play around with it, it got me thinking about how Jesus managed those very human responses behaviorally in regards to his environment and his effort. So when he was incredibly successful at the beginning of his ministry in Capernaum, huge crowds, everyone looking for him, he goes and ways and prays. And one way to read that is, that's what he did. He just went away and spoke to God. That's just the popular way we do it. But what if there was
make it part of our piety and our spiritual formation, always pray. When you have something successful, pray. So we moralize the story.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
But what if he had so much, endorphin going on from all the success, and the disciples where are you? Where have you been? And he's so differentiated. Jesus he doesn't tell them. He says, it's time for us to go somewhere else, less successful. Maybe he had to go away early in the morning because his hormones had to dissipate. So what's the place of his humanity and how prayer functions in that space to hear? And then also conflict when he was doing healings, and suddenly people around him were, we know, were threatening and plotting and angry, and did he stand above all of that? And I think actually he must have been engaged in that at a human level, feeling the hormones kicking in, the adrenaline. There must have been adrenaline. Must have been adrenaline in those moments. Must have been cortisol for heightened awareness. And again, what did he do in those moments? You see Jesus withdraw. So anyway, it got me thinking about, again, it may be too tangential, but Jesus' prayer, what was going on for him psychogenically, psychologically, physiologically in those moments of effort, expenditure, and kingdom understood. Does any of that make any sense other than posing a question?
Oh yeah, no, that's I can't help but read the Bible that way these days.
Right. Yeah.
For enemy love, when Jesus tells us to pray for our enemies, we can make that moralistic or piety, a certain piety, which is not wrong, right? So literally pray for your enemies. But then I start thinking, well, what's happening to us neurologically and physiologically as I bring my enemy to mind and I think about them and then I seek that God would bless them? And it's well, I'm learning how to down regulate fight or flight responses in my imagination. And what you hear is when you hear that, people who overcome phobias, they do the similar thing. So if I'm afraid of a dog, and I'm trying to overcome that phobia, what will I do is I will imagine a dog. And then I'll notice that my heart starts beating and I start sweating, and then now I've become aware that my body responds that way. And then I can do that again, maybe a week later,
Yeah.
and I can try to train my body to respond
Mm.
differently to the thoughts of my imagination. And so now I wonder, well, is that what Jesus also wanted to happen when we prayed for our enemies? Is that we learn how to down regulate fight or flight
Mm.
amygdala responses, as well as bring forth God's blessing upon them? Both those things would end up bringing more peace in the world. So,
I mean,
so yeah, so, so
that's
I don't know
another
if that fits your
yeah, it
your
does. Well,
example.
it's another conversation we've had away from here today. Is that, I mean, this is the exciting thing about, for me, this realm of neuroscience and theology, is making accounts of things that we have either found by accident or through the process of history. Christian practices just do those things. So there are certain things you do in spiritual direction that act on you, that we can now understand with regards to neuroscience. Go, oh, that's part of what's going on in you. It doesn't make it any less Christian, but that's how you are centered. That's how you are differentiated. That's how you become a different person and transformed, which speaks to the question of how does God integrate and connect with us? And this is not anything lack of faith. This is about God's integration. If God made us, surely he would be integrated with everything about us. And scripture tells us that he is with our thoughts and our makeup, from our mother's womb. His engagement, the very act of how Jesus' conception is God's full participation in humanity in every level, including the cognitive and neuroscience.
Yeah. Well, that I've been, teaching, and I'm sure you and I both and many others have been trying to reclaim the full humanity of Jesus,
Yeah.
in the sense that we, receive our humanity through his humanity, and so we want to emphasize his full humanity. And then the more I learn about these things, like you just said, it keeps filling out. And so you're asking, well, how did Jesus live with an amygdala, and then how does these different stories of him retreating and interacting with people, how does that kind of fit in those things, which I think is great, which is why I think we're reading these books and these types of things. Well, so as we start landing the plane, I had
Yeah.
these two final questions, which is, well, how
Okay.
does this behavior investment theory help us pastorally as
Yeah.
well as maybe theologically? And I know we've already hit the theological already,
Yeah.
but how does this kind of just the starting point, and you've already kind of mentioned, well, there needs to be more because humans do things for a wide array of reasons. And he talks about, on top of the basic behavior investment, that we also seek social resources. And so he says, human beings are social, and that social resources are even more important to human survival than material resources like food and water and shelter. All right, so maybe the next time we could talk about that. And then he talks about how we justify. We use language to justify our actions, and so that's like the next level. So there are kind of like these much more complicated kind of levels of human
Yeah.
existence that he kind of gets
Yeah.
at. But at this most basic level, what do you think this helps us do theologically or pastorally, like for you? Or maybe at
Yeah.
least gives you language around
Oh,
it.
yeah. Let's do the pastoral one. He made me think about, again, there's this layering to existence, that this flows from this, flows from this, flows, to this. And with behavioral science, cognitive science, and philosophy, I think there's an inherence that I've certainly been seeing around something like, in terms of good spiritual direction or Ignatian spirituality, and this was a way pastorally I would read Henriques, and anyone thinking, what the heck has this got to do with everyday life? So I think the three levels. The first one is surface and circumstances. How do human beings engage in their circumstances? And pastorally, that's what we're doing as pastors a lot with people day to day, isn't it? Their circumstances, what's happened to them, what might be happening to them, and maybe that's the best place for BIT, abbreviating it today, is understanding a bit more about what's going on there. But then I think there's the behavioral and character level, which is how do human beings actually consciously resist that understanding? It's like, yeah, that may be how human beings behave, but I am going to choose something different. I think there is a space and place where we work on, we would call it character. You see in the resurgence in Stoicism at the minute, And
Yeah.
actually, like, it's like, yeah, everything may be happening to me, but I have agency. The notion of it, where is agency in here to choose how I respond? It doesn't matter what happens to me. I can still choose how I respond. But say, bringing that all the way back to James Clear and the question he poses on identity. And I think this is for me was the very limits of the book, because it doesn't speak to it. I certainly didn't think it did. That identity creation, to be God made and not self made or evolutionary made. Where is the place that God creates us? So beyond our apathy or indifference because of behavior and entropy and effort, where is the cruciform life and participating with Christ? Because I think pastorally we dare to believe that's the place where we're supposed to, and we often don't go to. Where the Spirit hovered over creation and God wants to create us. So pastorally, that was just one of the way that I filtered it through in my head in terms of a schema and saying, I don't think it really hits down here. But
no, that's great. And that's where we're pressing into, well, we can learn these helpful tidbits. So for me, it's just remembering there's a lot more going on under the surface that is sometimes semi-automatic that people are not conscious about. That's what for theology and neuroscience in general. But what you're saying too is, well, that's true. And what is God calling us to, or how has God made us in his image and things? Jen, who's watching on YouTube, she asked, well, in what ways does God then become an energy source? And I think pastorally, that is my question. Is so if we are seeking and conserving energy, then I would assume that most evolutionary psychologists would say that religion is part of that energy conserving process, or it's part of our social engagement process. But there's no like energy that we're actually receiving from God that's inputting into our psychic life. Where theology does say that, right? So I literally believe that by the Holy Spirit's work in me, I do end up getting more neurological, psychic, relational energy given to me and given to my community of faith, because God is at work inputting additional resources that are not available in the natural world. Right. And so at the end of the day, Jen, I would say, yeah, God becomes an energy resource. But most often psychology and other kind of disciplines will kind of have to explain away. Though that's not really an energy resource. What's happening is that you're receiving significance, or you're receiving a justification for your behavior. So it's really an explanation, but it's not an actual source. It's not a resource. And so that's one way to think of it is, yeah, I do believe that God is a resource worth pursuing, because I believe that in my pursuit of God, and this goes back to a relationship and the relational pursuit of God, is that if I pursue God, I will, in a sense, get a benefit. Now, that doesn't make God a cost-benefit equation, right? It's like spiritual disciplines, but at the end of the day, you kind of have to believe something like that, that you're receiving more than what you're expending. And even the disciples, they wrestled with what that actually meant, right? Because they thought that they were going to get an earthly kingdom. We have left all these things, Jesus, and he says, you won't be, it won't all be in vain. Is that a seed dies and is reborn, right? So he kind of put it on a different time or metaphysical horizon than what the disciples initially thought. But Jesus never said, like,
beyond the second law of thermodynamics, in what comes next, you will be rewarded.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically,
exactly.
Didn't he? I mean, sorry, keep going.
No. So that was the first one.
Okay.
The second one is just well, I love the ones you said, so I'll just transition to the theology, and you brought this up too, is the return of teleology and purpose. Like all throughout his text, and we'll be getting to this probably in later chapters, is he does talk about purpose, and he never problematizes purpose. Purpose is not, at least my understanding, is not a naturalistic kind of category. Purpose, teleology is what's the end in mind, like all the business, all the professionals like have the, start with why.
Start with why.
It's everywhere, right? But when you boil it down, if you just have a purely naturalistic worldview, there is no why and there is no purpose.
Yes.
And so now I feel like we're kind of, if we're to do kind of the history of metaphysics, during the Enlightenment and before that, during the Reformation, there was really a chopping of the tree of Aristotelian metaphysics, which was teleological, which is you understand and know things by the
Yeah.
end, and natural science, what we understand
And
as
you know what is good and what is virtuous.
right. But what we understand as natural science or the scientific revolution came from not starting there, but looking at cause and effect. But cause and effect looks backwards, and it can tell you all sorts of things that are super helpful, like how to come up with a vaccine really fast in the midst of a pandemic, right? That is a cause and effect kind of viewpoint, looking at past interactions and projecting them into the future. But this idea of purpose is really a forward-looking kind of category, and it seems that Henriques and others are really kind of emphasizing that a lot more. And you even brought in Stoicism and things like that.
Yeah.
And maybe Stoicism, I know it gets a bad rap, but I'm wondering if it's making a comeback for a reason. So, but that's maybe a different conversation. So, anyways, the idea of
whole
purpose
conversation,
coming back
yeah.
is, I think,
Yeah.
very fascinating, and of course, I think dovetails extremely well for theologians, right? So
yeah, absolutely, because there are only questions you think of everything. So this book itself, whether you're reading economic history, whether you're reading something from the Frankfurt School, whether you're reading continental philosophy, at the end of it you go, but why do human beings behave like that? Why? What's the why underneath it? Yeah. Other than, because again, you could take a humanistic point of view, a materialistic point of view. It just is the way it is. Well, that's the space that theology gets to speak to and go, well, there are reasons why that might be the way it is. And there are things about how it could be different to the way it is. So you mentioned the theological. I'll share this one to close here. So and all of this and reading the book, again, thinking about it makes me think about my theological anthropology, human identity, teleology, what's life, what can you expect in life, not expecting life, what comes in, a belief in what comes after this life, that there is more to life than this life and to live within it, that Jesus kept talking about. I've just read the Sermon on the Mount again this morning in my Bible readings. Jesus like, invest your life for what comes after this one, again, which we might now read as after the second law of thermodynamics. Here is what will come next, and my resurrection will be the proof of that. The scandal of Christianity is not the cost-benefit analysis. It's not the praying prayers like you and I have talked endlessly for years. It's not praying prayers to go to heaven when you die. It's not an insurance policy against the second law of thermodynamics. That's not the scandal of Christianity. The scandal of Christianity is you are not free, this is a Christological understanding, to create yourself freely into anything that you want to be. Now, you and I at a cursory level, that I can't make myself 8 foot tall. There's things that you just can't do. I'm not going to play rugby for England anymore. I can't endlessly and effortlessly self-create myself. But the scandal of Christianity is universalism and particularism, is that it's only in Christ not just a belief, but an actual psychological, physical, spiritual, material, in every level, relationship with Jesus, that you will become the person you were meant to be and live with the consequences of that for eternity and the benefits of that for eternity. That's what's at stake under all of this for me, theologically.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. So that's what, maybe to land the plane, I'm really interested in this conversation with a new unified theory of psychology, is that he is trying to organize, well, where is the freedom amidst the non-freedom in one sense, or what are the variables that can't be changed, and then what are the things that we are unique or that we bring to a situation. And this idea that life is a forward moving cost benefit analysis of energies, and then later he brings on relationships and culture, is helpful, because I think it's right as far as our humanity. And by our humanity, I mean that half of our humanity that is definitively animal, but then there's also part of our humanity that is not, whatever it is, definitively animal, and we can argue about what that is. And so how do we make that distinction? So we need to take account of, and this is why I want to read this book and read neuroscience, is we have to take account of, and a really good account of, well, what makes us, what's our animal nature? What is that? And what are the things that we can or cannot do because of that? Because when we know that, then we can embrace the reality of who we are rather than, fight for freedom or however. But then the theological is, but are we more or different, or what's the and that is also
Mm,
part of that? And so that's
mm.
what I find really interesting in all these conversations. So, yeah.
Excellent.
Well, what should we do next time? What's your, or we should make no promises on air where people can hear us and then we can
That's
brainstorm
true.
later.
That's true.
Well, this for the people who are listening to this recorded or still listening online, this is we, the we didn't describe this at the beginning, but top level domain was kind of started, I think, as a, I don't know if it was a joke by you, Jason, or not. And I was like, oh, I like that name. I'm all about the names.
Yeah, I suggested top level domain. It's just like, can we move again? So my deep desire, you're like, methodologically, is there a way to get above a lot of what's going on and try and find some ways to make good accounts and conversations? I mean, I love the idea of map making, and when people make maps, good map makers will overlay maps. They look for where, well, if we take that factor socially, if we take that factor, how people's ages, if we take that factor in terms of something that's happened, you can start to see something. And for me, I think that's what this project is with you and ultimately got me attracted. It's like, how can we make some maps from these things so we can find a place to stand, see the world, make better accounts of the world in here with reality. And ultimately, we're pastors. We want people's lives to be better.
Mm-hmm. And the map making works at different levels, right? And so we need to for different purposes. And I think that this idea of the top level domain is, well, you have economics, you have psychology, you have race and racism, you have all sorts of different fields,
Philosophy.
domains, that kind of want to say what humanity is, what it's for, how it behaves. And we would kind of want to say, well, we need to kind of, rather than be lost in the fray of, social media, current events, like how can we kind of raise this up a little bit as pastors and theologians? So that's kind of our goal in our friendship together. And then, hopefully we'll be able to bring others in on it as we progress.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thanks again. And for all of you who are listening, recording, or live, thank you for being a part of everything.